Hi, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the podcast where we share our stories from the battlefield of consulting. I'm your host, Johnny Hill.
And I'm Tim Baker.
I'm Juliana Ratchford.
I'm Bruno Berizzo.
Hey, I'm Kareem Jamal.
Today, we're talking all about modernization. Let's get started. So let's just start off by defining what we mean when we say modernization. In particular, we're talking about in software. But what is modernization?
I would go with pushing new version of software, getting new software in, getting new tools in. Yeah, just bring your organization forward in time to what's going on around you.
So I think it's not just about software. I think, and I've got my financial services hat on here. I think it isn't just about upgrading systems. I think it's kind of rethinking the ways that value is delivered through technology to customers. So I think modernization can be transforming business processes, becoming more data-driven, becoming more customer-centric, and financial services, particularly, taking old and ugly and making it new. Historically, banks have been built on very old systems, but those old systems were developed to support relatively slower moving markets and relatively either less sophisticated customers or less demanding customers. But now I think everyone expects better solutions, more intuitive solutions, but they also expect things to be fast and they expect data to be connected together. But the purpose of all of that is to transform businesses and respond to competitive forces.
For me, it's really upgrading, improving, enhancing, or up-leveling the experience, right? So as Tim said, it's more focused on the experience. It could be software, it could be processes, it could be something else altogether. But it's that experience that the user interacts with to do their day-to-day tasks.
And even adding on to that, from a user experience, user design perspective, addressing the user pain points and making sure that you're streamlining, improving the user journey, improving accessibility, usability, and performance too.
And also, what Tim mentions about banks reminds me something. So banks usually get pretty slow at pushing changes because they are system critical. So it's hard to get new people if you keep working on COBOL, for example. So when new people come in, it's easier sometimes to just start working on a new, more modern stack that train like a 20-year-old to write a COBOL program. So I think that some of the decision cannot be escaped. You start needing to move to the future, otherwise you start to die, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as I was reflecting, and a lot of banking is built kind of on-prem, not in the cloud. You mentioned COBOL, Bruno, so relatively old tech. And I think at some point it gets to a breaking point. Either you can't support it or it's just too slow and you have to modernize. And it's actually quite a big delta. It's no longer kind of tweaking and continuously improving. You kind of have to fundamentally modernize, build a new stack, start in the cloud. And all of these new cloud capabilities, and I'm sure we'll talk about AI later on, enable you to modernize in areas where maybe you couldn't modernize before because it was frozen in time. The payments industry, bank payments is frozen in time.
I think we've highlighted sort of both ends of the modernization spectrum, right? One, initially we were talking about the more by desire, right? So you want to modernize something or improve the user. The other thing that we talked about a little later is the by need, right? So you don't have the people to keep it up, or the backend system that is supporting this is now being deprecated. And so you have no choice but to upgrade, right? Otherwise your system will just stop functioning altogether. And in that you may take take it a little further and just say, okay, we're going to modernize the experience as well in front of it while we're doing this effort. But it doesn't have to be. It might just be sort of a like for like migration where on the front, the facade, nothing changes, and all the other stuff is happening underneath the covers to just keep the system alive. So like upgrading from C to like C++ or something, right? Just because you have to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like there's a lot we could get into, like the underlying reasons behind like why is a modernization effort needed in this case. It may be, like you're saying, Kareem, external factors, it may be internal factors. There's a number of reasons why. I know a big one that I've heard when the iPhone came out, it introduced a very sophisticated consumer-centric experience to people who were used to more clunky experiences. And it kind of over time created this expectation, why can't all software be this intuitive or this easy or this nice to look at, this easy on the eyes, whatever it may be. And over time, there became more of a demand in like, yeah, I know this is a clunky enterprise system, but I don't want it to feel like it is. And yeah, I know this isn't a, customer facing thing, but why does it have to be such a headache to use? So those kinds of considerations, I think, as there is this mass adoption of sophisticated but easy to use software in iPhones and in web services and web apps, you started to see more of that demand. Like, I don't want to get stuck using this thing that was coded 20 years ago, and I have to jump through all these hoops just to download a report or whatever it may be. So that's often a
Yeah,
reason I've heard before behind like why modernization is needed.
I think that's driven the expectation of users. If I think about the iPhone as a great example, where you're in a map and you can click in the map and it will take you to book a restaurant. Everyone now expects all their software to interoperate. They expect it to talk to each other. And I think that expectation, I think AI, okay, I said it again, everyone's going to expect to be able to talk to their application at some point or to have a co-pilot helping you with that application. We're all going to get very kind of lazy. So I think at some point, if your application doesn't interoperate with other applications or data, or doesn't talk to you or interpret your needs in an intuitive way, then it's going to be considered unusable.
Mm-hmm.
And the need to modernize will expand.
Yeah, about the expectations, that's a pretty multiple-edged sword because you have the expectations of the user that is going to use your tool, but also you have the expectations like those inside, that the people that is building the thing. They also have expectations about the tools that they need to use every day. So if you want to be successful, you need to balance both. So that will also push you forward. And it's funny that you mentioned the iPhone, because when the iPhone came out, Apple was using a pretty old technology behind the scenes that is called Objective-C. It was like a 40 years old language that no one was using because it was deprecated like 20 years ago. But when the iPhone came in, everyone was learning Objective-C again because it was the whole thing. was super funny. So yeah, you had like this weird warp on time, and you need to learn this pretty old thing to build the new stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think another reason why modernization is required outside of kind of the demands of users is things like security and cyber, because so many systems, there's a lot of stuff going on in the news about vulnerabilities of systems running hospitals and hotels and businesses, and obviously these are mission critical functions. And so I think, because of bad actors out there, I think modernization is being required to keep those systems safe and the people safe and the data secure. So I think that's another big driver for modernization.
Yeah, security, general like performance, I know is often an issue. Like it's just old and slow, and users will not accept that anymore. Or even like maybe it was fast at one point, but something has changed in the meantime and we can't compete anymore. I think that's another big one, like competition with other systems that are maybe newer or faster or more efficient or don't take as many steps to complete the same kind of actions. There's a lot of those kinds of reasons too that can say like, okay, well, we might still be doing okay right now, but if we stay where we are much longer, we're going to be outpaced by the competition.
You also have to sort of look forward as well, because right now the working demographic is continuously changing, right? And as we mentioned, expectations. And so there's a balance, almost a clash of expectations where some of the current demographic is, hey, this is built into my muscle memory, so don't move my cheese, right? Type of mentality. Whereas the new demographic that's coming up that was, born with the iPhone, they want things to be efficient and, swipeable and all this other cool stuff now. So there's also a clash there you have to keep in mind when you try to modernize.
We've had clients, and I've seen this over the years, who run stuff in the back office and processes that, because of the increase of volume in markets, they can't run fast enough and process all the trades by the end of the day. And I think another big reason for modernization is just driven by the sheer volume and complexity of markets. And it's not just financial markets. I think it's everything. There's, huge amounts of data being produced everywhere. And so you've got to modernize old systems because they're not programmed and not built to cope with the sheer volume of data, but also the analytics that have to be calculated on the back of that data.
Yeah, it's an interesting point how it might not be that anything with my system is necessarily changing or wrong, but all the systems I'm interfacing with, or like there's new ways to do it that are more efficient. So it might not necessarily be like, oh, my system is old and broken and beat up, but it can no longer efficiently work with these other systems, or it can no longer compete compared to something else. So like I think that's also a factor. Like it's easy to think modernization is for systems that are, 20, 30 years old and they're, collecting dust and there's cobwebs everywhere. But it can also be a fairly recent thing like, oh yeah, this is only 2 years old, but in order to stay relevant, we're going to modernize an aspect of, of something we did that, needs to interface differently, or there's a new technology that would allow us to do this more efficiently. Like, I guess I'm speaking kind of abstractly, but I feel like it's easy to think modernization is exclusively for really old systems, but it's kind of a continual effort. There's always something that can be improved, always new ways to approach problems to become more efficient or more effective.
In addition to that, there's also regulatory things that come in that force you to modernize at times when you weren't planning for it, right? And so you get a regulation and you get some timeline to comply. And if you're not in compliance, well, you have to get a modernization effort moving quickly to bring yourself into compliance, right? Like recently, the trade settlement went from T+2 days to T+1, right? And Tim was saying that the workload is so much they can't keep up already. Well, you know what? This might increase that workload as well. So there's probably other stuff that needs to happen to make that a lot more efficient. Otherwise, they will, face consequences and possibly fines and other implications from it.
I was going to say, I think on that note too, of making things more effective, unifying different systems together and bringing multiple applications together, kind of connecting different pieces. I know I've worked on a couple of projects where you're putting together one application, but then it can launch into different applications and sort of a partnership as well.
Mhm. A common thing may just be, oh, well, this company has a perfectly serviceable system, but they just got bought. And now they have to combine that system with whoever bought them, or they're merging with another company so that they can have, a more effective overall product. But there's work that needs to be done to bring those products together. So it might not necessarily be it's this old clunky system. It's just there's two systems that are different that need to learn how to work together seamlessly. And that's a modernization effort too, in and of itself.
Yeah, and also modernization doesn't mean for the better. Sometimes, sometimes it's just you get pushed to something that is new and you have to deal with it. So yeah, it's I think you, Johnny, mentioned this before. This is a constant thing. There is no like a big hit, or not usually a big hit of the reality that say, hey, you need to keep up. But it's something that is happening like every day. You need to be aware of where are you accumulating these technical depth and be prepared to deal with it. Otherwise, you will end up like an old bank that just have this pile of things that no one really knows how it works because the people that write it left the company 20 years ago. So you are on your own dealing with that. So yeah, I think it's something that you need to keep an eye on permanently.
That's an interesting point. I'm curious to hear more what y'all think about that. Like, there are wrong ways to approach modernization. Like, Bruno, you were kind of saying that, like, it's not always necessarily for the best. It might be something that you feel forced into, and you, because of the circumstances, you actually implement it poorly, and then you have to go back and fix your modernization things that went wrong. So let's talk a little bit about that and like how can you approach it in the right way, but what are some of the common mistakes that might be made in a modernization effort?
Partly perception, right? Like going back to the workplace experience demographic clash, you might, the younger generation or the incoming might think that this modernization effort is positive, but the more experienced people, the veterans that are there, may see it as change and may perceive it negatively, right? So there's a perception factor there that you have to delicately balance as well, because in all aspects, it may reduce the number of steps by, say, three. But if the people that have been working there, their muscle memory is used to the previous steps, and these reduction of three steps keeps making them mess up to where they have to actually click 8 times instead of, three, then that's actually a downgrade for them, right? So you have to walk through some of these scenarios as well with the different samples of the user groups.
Yeah, I can't remember how many times like Facebook would completely update or overhaul how it works, and people hated it. Granted, they eventually got used to it because Facebook said, sorry, there's no going back. This is the new way we're doing things. But I'm certain they lost users in that process because it wasn't a slow iterative, like, hey, here's this new thing coming. Here are things that are changing. Here's how you can set up if you prefer other way of doing things. It was just kind of like one day, oh, it's different. Get used to it. Taking your time to explain why the modernization is happening, why things are changing, how it's going to change for the better, and kind of showing some of your homework too, instead of like, we think this will be better. Say, hey, we've noticed that this is how many people use the system, so we're changing this to make it more efficient for everyone. And in doing that, people might realize, oh, I didn't even know I could do it that way. I've been doing it this way with more steps because I didn't realize it was so easy if I did this other process. So those kinds of things too, you can lessen the negative impact just through communicating clearly.
Yeah, I think when I think about this, and I've been involved as sponsor of projects which were way too big and complex and big change programs. And the only way we could really de-risk them was to break them down into manageable pieces so that we could deliver value back to the business, as we're going. Because, again, big institutions and banks, they might have a transformation program that's 4, 5, 6, 7 years, but you can't wait until the end of that period to deliver something better. So I think there's a constant tension between, the need for stability and, again, a lot of regulated environments. It's very risky to change things because you can break them. But the flip side is you want to continuously improve the system so that you don't end up with 20 years of legacy tech that you literally have to blow the whole thing up and start again. I'm probably in the camp of continuously improve the systems as you go and, have an approach that keeps your users or systems, happy through that process. So you're constantly delivering better performance. I think if you think about the iPhone, it's gradually improved over many, many years. So there's no kind of need for a big bang. And there have been tons of examples where there has been a big bang and it's not quite worked. And banks have not gone out of business, but they've been shut down for a day while they've rolled everything back. So I think modernization is inherently risky. So you've got to spend a lot of time kind of de-risking it.
Right. And there are times it's not worth it. Like there are times where you need to be able to assess and say, yes, we would get these benefits if we modernized in this area, but it's not worth the potential loss of customers. Let's think of a different strategy. And it might be, yeah, the solution isn't a huge modernization effort that all happens at once. It's okay, we'll iteratively improve things, heavily involve users for feedback and validation to make sure we're actually approaching it the right way. I think when you hear modernization, it's easy to think you change everything and one day it's one way, the next day it's different. Whereas I think the most effective modernization efforts are ongoing and gradual, right? It's the kind of thing where you're identifying things, testing things very thoroughly, communicating, here's what's changing and when, rather than just like snap your fingers and everything's different.
You have to control the pace of your change, right? There's just so much that people can digest at once too much, and then they will get overwhelmed and back off and start freaking out a bit, right? So if you overnight introduce sort of a, hypothetically a new laptop model that takes away all the ports and replaces it by just only USB-C, right?
What?
And then you need
Who would do
dongles for
that?
everything, then, there's probably going to be some backlash because that's a little bit too much change,
Mhm.
all at once, where people need to put in workarounds to get to be their old productive self again. So you sort of have exactly gradual and balanced and see how much appetite people have for change at a time.
Mhm.
The other thing I've seen done, and this is I've seen this done with CRM platforms where firms have built their own CRM platforms, for example, and they've decided to just buy Salesforce or buy, a vendor solution. What they've quite often done is they've stood up the new solution and they've had a migration where the end users have the choice and they've sold on the benefits ultimately of moving to the new solution. So that's another way of kind of overcoming some of the risk around going from one, system for books and records. We had another client that had two sets of books and records. Now that creates another problem, but eventually the goal was to move to the modern one from the old one. But that approach requires you to win over the business and be systematic about how you do that. But that can be an alternative to essentially polishing the turd, constantly trying to improve something that's old and bring your clients along and users along for the ride, as opposed to have a brand new shiny thing over here and then encourage them to migrate to it.
Yeah, one other approach I've seen before that it sometimes works, and it's probably better than some other approaches I've seen, is like the highest value elements are what you modernize and change, but
Mm.
you leave the stuff that like isn't interacted with a lot, isn't used as often for kind of a later thing. So often how that manifests itself is everything that's customer facing is shiny and polished and fast and new, but everything that internal users or the kind of people running the show, all the admin stuff is still running on stuff that's 20 years old and it's slow and it's clunky and it's confusing and it looks like it's running on Windows 95. But you wouldn't know it if you were just a customer using the software. You wouldn't think that it's all built off of this really ancient approach. So that can work, especially if it's the kind of thing where like the old stuff is only used once every month, and it's not that big of a deal if it runs slower because 50% of the stuff is fast enough and the rest of it is up to date and being upgraded. So it's like it's too low impact to be worth completely rebuilding since it's not used that often. But it can eventually, that approach can come back to bite you if security flaws are found or if something is no longer being supported. And I think Kareem kind of mentioned that before. Like it might be like it'll just stop working because it's so old. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I have seen that approach work in the past, especially when like budget and time is limited. Say like what's the high priority stuff? We'll hit that first and we'll
Yeah.
try to come back and iteratively fix the stuff that not as many people use or see, but does eventually need to be addressed.
I think that's a great point. I think winning over those users by addressing a pain point that they have, something that is, a lot of copy and pasting or moving data around or an area where it just takes them way too long, even though that might be peripheral to the modernization you're doing because you're changing the whole back end as well. But if you can address those pain points and win people over, I mean, getting adoption of new solutions is incredibly hard. Humans don't like to change. But if you can make their life easier, have them go home at 5 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock because the system actually, is performant or easy to use, then I think that's a great strategy. And to me, it goes back down to breaking down a project into, a set of deliverables over time and make sure that you're delivering value to end users and the business over time rather than as a big bang.
Yeah, and I think something like that builds trust with the users and the brand also.
Totally. When you've been looked after as a user, yeah, trust is so important. And the flip side is trust is easily lost. If something is not intuitive, not well designed, or breaks, then people are going to go, we've been waiting for this thing for a year and it's rubbish. I want to go back to the old system.
And then they can be eager to adopt a completely different system or competitor if that's available to them.
Right. That's also a challenge I've seen with like, it might not necessarily be that we need to modernize because everything is old, but it's just that someone else has something that's better and faster and newer and shinier, and it's drawing people away. And yeah, how can we show that we're taking that threat seriously and competing and showing users like, yeah, we recognize that you see value this other place. We're providing that same value here. One thing, Tim, that you said that also kind of made me think about, if you take the approach that we're just going to modernize it and be done, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because modernization, we've already said, is like a continual thing. There's always something that can be improved, always things that need to be changed, or it could be faster, or it could be more efficient, or things that are no longer supported. So if you have the mindset, let's just knock it all out and be done, you're going to have to just do it again. But if you can take the approach where we're always assessing what could be better, what could change, what could be improved, and not just on the technology side, like you said, in the business and how are we positioning ourselves in the marketplace, all that kind of stuff. Having that open mind to say, we can't just stay where we're at. How can we improve from here continually is important.
I've never seen an all at once ever succeed. Of course, I'll be proven wrong because there's probably some rare case somewhere that it has, but for the most part, those never end well, and you always have
Yeah.
to backtrack and then do it again. As Juliana said, it's that trust, right? So you want to modernize a little bit first in a contained space after doing your sort of analysis and change that and build that trust with users that yes, this is the right approach. We want to hear your feedback before we let that sort of ripple into other parts of the application. Not only for the user, but for yourself and the clients, it is that sort of validation test where you pick a piece, modernize that, and then move forward with other pieces. We're actually doing that with our screener at a couple clients too, right? So we're going in and modernizing that one experience, and as things go well and they get good feedback, then we can, go tackle other parts of the application and the site that are pain points that now we can bring into this more modernized experience as well.
That's a good point, Kareem. I think one thing you said that I think is worth kind of jogging back to is you've never seen it succeed when you try to do it all at once. I think a big part of that is defining from the very beginning, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? What would success look like? Because I think it's easy to just think, oh, well, it'll just be faster and everyone will love it. That's a pretty vague way of measuring success. But if you can set up from the beginning, okay, we're currently losing X% of customers a month because of how old the system is. A success metric would be, we get that down to this percent or that percent, or we're gaining this percent of customers, or having metrics in place so you can tell, oh, people are using the system for longer, or they're doing more things that we have been telling them that is available that they didn't know about, whatever it may be. But defining how can we measure this as a success when you're in the planning phase so that you can A, have a goal to work towards, and B, know if you're hitting that goal.
It strikes me that the old way of building applications was very monolithic. It was, by definition, they were hard to change. You couldn't change the front end without changing the back end, or the data structure. And that kind of held things back. This notion of being systematic about modernizing your experience or your solution implies, I think, that you've got a much more modular design. And to your point, Kareem, you mentioned what we're doing with the screener. In our connected platform, we've got these components and they interoperate and talk to each other, share the same DNA, but we can modernize each component without breaking anything. The way the data connects to those modules, is very kind of arm's length and configurable. So I think a lot of the challenge, and I think this is very much how we build solutions for our customers, is a much more modular approach so that things can be upgraded and changed without a lot of dependency on other systems. And obviously modern APIs and data lakes and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure, contributes to that ability. But I think, back to one of the reasons why we have so many old systems, particularly at financial institutions, is because they are monolithic. They're very big and running an old code.
Yeah, and also other manifestation of the modular tendency is that things get much faster to the hands of the user than before. So deploying something new, it should be much faster, and you should deploy many times in a short period of time. So that's other way that you can have outpaced by your competition, because they modernize, so they deliver new things every week. So you cannot keep up with the change.
Well, we've hardly talked about AI. I mean, it's quite interesting watching what's going on in the market, because obviously there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of activity and some amazing capabilities. I think actually it's moving so fast that it's almost like, actually don't build anything, build something next week or the week after, because the stack will be better, the solutions will
Right.
be better. But so there's that kind of conundrum. But I'm seeing and talking to a lot of clients now about how they're thinking about using AI to solve quite acute, small kind of workflows or issues around particular things, like this type of trade or onboarding this type of data. Microsoft talks about co-pilots, but it's a good word really, a co-pilot to do something quite narrow. But I think as you're back to the point about how do you architect systems, I think you've got to be thinking now about a system you're building today. You've got to be thinking about how you're going to strap in your co-pilot. How are you going to, organize your data in such a way that the AI can have access to it? Our front-end solutions are very composable. So retrofitting AI is quite straightforward for us, because the AI can understand not just the data, but also how to display it and which components and modules that are appropriate for time series data or tabular data or geospatial data. So I think, and I say this to clients about our platform and how we build systems, we're trying to build them so that they're AI ready. And in a way that's thinking more about future-proofing your platform so that you don't have a big modernization challenge in 2 years when you go, okay, we're ready to do AI now. We just re-platformed 2 years ago and it doesn't work with AI. We're going to have to do the whole thing all over again.
I think that AI is keeping exploding. Like every month there's a new bomb dropping. So it's hard to build anything on that rhythm, because what you build today will be obsolete next week. So it's kind of a weird mixture of saying, okay, I kind of ready to jump, but not really. So when you really see that window opening, when you see the value of applying it, you can take it. There are many edges of this. For example, if you integrate with an LLM today, how you will keep up like for years. You need to think in terms of years at least to make a reasonable decision about technology. So it's hard. But getting back to the point that Tim was mentioning, at this point, there is no option to be AI ready, because the amount of data that you are going to accumulate, even if you are just a person selling stuff on a web page, on 2 months, you will have like 10,000 visits to go through it. So you will need some intelligence around that. So the needs for AI are already installed. You need to have that in mind when you build a real system.
Yeah.
Regardless of the flavor of the AI. If you want to put a LLM that maybe is like a high risk on the map, but there is other kind of AI that you can run today that has 20 years of testing in the battlefield, so you can really rely on that to take decisions. So there's no way that you are not AI ready right now when you plan a system moving forward.
Because of the rapid change and new large language models being released, AI solutions, they're building them now so they can switch to a new component. And there are many components, and our solution seems to use a number of different technologies, but building it in a modular way is, I think, essential, because if you build it all on one large language model and hard code everything, you won't be able to take advantage of that new, more powerful, cheaper to run model that comes out literally next week.
Yeah.
So it's having a big implication on the infrastructure and how you configure that, not just the kind of the data at the bottom and the views and workflows at the top.
It does help define your success criteria, right? So your effort might be seen as a success now, but if you haven't taken these things into account, then 2 years later, when you're ready for it, it might actually be seen as a failure, right? Even though it was lauded right now. And so that's something like, you have to evaluate for eventual failure, right? As well, not just immediate failure.
Mhm.
I was with a customer earlier this week, and they've gone through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and they really felt they were behind some of the big banks like JP Morgan, who were spending billions on modernization. And I said, look, this AI wave at the moment could actually enable you to catch up really quickly. So there might be a leveling, because some firms who have been more systematic and organized and maybe have rebuilt their systems over the last 5 years might not have the lead that they would have had, because it can be eroded so quickly by putting these co-pilots into the workflows. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the playing field is kind of leveled.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that can help with keeping things flexible and adaptable is just focusing on your users and not making assumptions on their behalf. So I think there's the risk of going too big too quickly or implementing something new very quickly just for having that what feels like a competitive advantage. But I think there's the risk of, do your users actually need that? And I think that's something that just keeping in mind what they actually need, what they interact with, and not making assumptions, testing iteratively can help balance the two there and keep things flexible and adaptable in that sense.
Yeah, on the note of AI, if you're saying, oh, well, we'll just put a chatbot in it, and then we can say we're using AI, and your users don't use it and don't want it and don't actually see the value in it, you'd probably be better served doing some research and figuring out AI might be the right thing to implement, but the way in which you do it matters a lot, and you can do it wrong. And your users will say, I didn't want this, I'm leaving, I'm going to find a better tool that actually does what I need. So, yeah, that's definitely true. Like, the answer isn't just, oh, there's a new thing, let's do the new thing. But are you
Mhm.
picking the right new thing? Are you implementing it in the right way? And are you approaching it in a way where you can continually improve? I think those are all the big factors to consider.
I was gonna say something interesting enough, while I was testing internally with some people that I know, is that I've actually seen this sort of sentiment where them seeing another chat bot, it's almost like them mentally preparing, like, okay, you're also having to match what the user's expectation of AI is. So that's something that I found interesting as everything is kind of moving in that direction too.
Yeah, we had touched on trust, and when you bring AI into the picture, that trust requirement becomes so much higher, right? Because of the hallucinations and stuff. And so you really have to hone in on that trust point and also show the value as Juliana was saying. It's if it just shows up as another chatbot or something, well, typically your chatbot experience is you have a complaint or you're having a problem with the site. That's the only time you go to the chatbot, right? Whereas if your AI is meant to be an enabler, you want to position it as, hey, come to me first and I can help you with your work, not only when you have complaints, right? So it's a mental
Mhm.
shift too that you sort of have to present as the value proposition there. The other thing I'd say is to sort of make sure you avoid failure with these modernization efforts is what I'll coin the cheese analysis. Because you are moving their cheese, right? So I know it's very cheesy. But it's like what level are you doing? So we talked about the size of how much you're doing, right? So do incremental, not all at once. So that's like the size of your cheese, right? And then how much are you changing? And so, how far you're moving this bit of cheese to the next point, right? And then the other thing that we should touch on a little bit at least is, the type of cheese, right? Because that's important too, right? What domain, what entities are you dealing with, right? Is it cheddar, which is sort of common and goes with everything, and people aren't gonna have that much problem with it moving? Is it a little more spicy, like pepper jack, so people will be a little more heated with the change? Or is it like Swiss and it's more holy, right? And I'm equating holy with like more sensitive data. So, they'll be like up in arms because of it. That actually worked. So you have to be careful where your finance data or even emails, I would say, is more sensitive, right? If that stuff goes missing or out of place, there will be a lot more consequences and people will be angry versus if it's like an e-commerce site and some of the items move around or the filters change a little bit, probably that's a little bit more cheddary, right? And so you have to keep in mind too as you size your effort and figure out what types of entities you're dealing with.
Thanks for connecting with us today. If you have a complex software problem that needs solving, thoughts on what we discussed today, or ideas on what topics we should tackle next, feel free to reach out to us at podcast@experoinc.com or on Twitter @experoinc. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Is a cheese board, is that like a data lake?
I think, yeah, we can have some curds, some shredded cheese.
You should never mix the wrong cheeses either. And what about spreadability?
Yeah,
Kareem, this might be
exactly.
the cheesiest analogy you've ever made. The other thing is, what do you pair it with? Is it like cheese and nuts? Is it cheese and wine? I'm
I
just
like my
thinking about
cheese on a
lunch now.
taco. Yeah,
I was gonna say,
exactly.